Good evening from Nairobi. My name is Benjamin Muindi. I am very excited to join you in this online edition of International Journalism Week from Nairobi. And I have been asked by Dr. Bina to speak to the topic about media freedom in Kenya. And I was given the liberty to cover a topic of my own within that province of media freedom in Africa. And this evening I'll be speaking to you about journalistic freedoms in Kenya, or nuances of journalistic freedom from the Kenyan perspective. You can engage me on social media since this is a virtual presentation, and specifically on Twitter, which I have already shared on the conference website. My Twitter handle is @Muindi Mutie, which I believe that Bina will be able to project to your screens from the information that I've already shared with her. Welcome to my presentation, and I do have a co-presenter, Miss Mumo, who works for the Committee to Protect Journalists in Africa, and we will speak to this topic on journalistic freedoms from a Kenyan perspective, and I believe that Mumo will speak to the issues that the Committee of Protection of Journalists has been addressing within the African jurisdiction. At the start of my presentation, allow me to point out that journalists play a significant role in the society. You know, in the words of former International Communications Association President, Professor Babi Zeliza, she calls journalists interpretive community, and they are an interpretive community because they bear witness to events. They are the eyes and ears of the public in relation to the social occurrences and events of public interest that are important to society or have a bearing to society. And therefore, the discourse around media freedom, the protection thereof, is very important for journalists, for them to carry out their role in the society. For us to understand media freedom well, from a normative perspective, and hinged on literature, Sebet et al., for instance, have laid the background of understanding of media freedom, where they tell us that media freedom always takes the form and color of the social and political structures within which that particular media operates. But while this might be a very universal understanding of what media freedom really looks like, the specificity of these freedoms in different countries takes different forms and shape and color depending on, you know, the political and social structures. And therefore, you know, you have nuances of media freedom dependent on the political and social structures within which, you know, journalists are operating. There are certain variables that we consider when you're discussing media freedom, and I believe that this conference has already canvassed a lot of these variables, including things like the independence of journalists, media pluralism, ideas on safety of journalists, and infrastructure, which really, if they're looked at as baskets, then there are certain other sub-variables that fall within these baskets. However, when we try to interrogate media from an Afrocentric perspective, there is a lot of concerns that, you know, our appreciation of media and media systems as well as media freedom has been very Eurocentric, meaning that, you know, our appreciation of what media freedom looks like within African context for a long time has been looked from the lenses of Eurocentric perspectives. And that is why a lot of scholars, African scholars, including people like Professor Levi Obonyo, Professor Nyamjo, Professor Hayes Mabuyazera, among others, are asking that we need to move the debate to incorporate the realities of Africa when it comes to the issue of media freedom. And one of the questions that Professor Obonyo raises is, what is the social and political structures within which the African media operates? Because then if we appreciate the political structures that this media is operating in, then we'll be able to gain a clearer understanding, a better perspective about what media freedom would look like, or actually looks like from an African perspective. If we were to theorize media freedom from a social structuration theory, and looking at the work of Anthony Giddens and the idea of social structure having bearing on human agency, we need to come to a point of appreciation that the context is very important, yes, and the nuances of social structure, thinking about resources, for instance, thinking about rules, whether these rules are covert rules of operation or overt rules of operation that guide how human beings conduct their affairs, or how their agency is determined as they do action. Then if we look at journalists as part of that society, we appreciate that their agency can be determined by various laws, for instance, that governments come up with, whether directly or indirect laws. Or journalists can still be affected by provision of resources that will enable them to perform competently within the context in which they are operating. So if we were to map out these particular social structures, from a structuration perspective, we can say that media freedom in an African perspective can be affected at micro level, at meso level, and at a macro level. So within the micro level of journalistic freedoms, we are talking about those variables that would make a journalist at personal capacity not be able to articulate themselves or not be able to do their job competently. So we're looking at how are those journalists, for instance, trained, what are their professional ethos as they transit into praxis, and at this point when there is the contestation around who the journalist is because of technology, then non-professionals doing the work of professionals blurs the line on the idea of micro level factors. But professional journalists also operate within the context of an organization. And within the Kenyan context, for instance, we talk about the mainstream media. So we have organizations like my former employer, that is the Nation Media Group, for instance, one of the biggest conglomerates in the East African region. So when you look at the idea of organizational forces at meso level, at trying to speak to journalistic freedoms, you will find that the media mission, vision, the bottom line, things around that, how the organization is structured, have a bearing on journalistic freedoms. And things like how the media model, for instance, if this media, for instance, is hinged on an economic model of advertising, for instance, you find that those organizational policies have a bearing on what journalists can and can't publish. But outside that, then there are social institutions that operate at, outside extra media forces. And talking about political players, economic players, legal, the legal fraternity. And then outside that, we talk about the macro system. What is the political context? What is the political ideology in which this journalism is being practiced? I'm actually very pleased that this conference has been hinged around the idea of the changing media ecology because of technology, because of things like the internet and the affordances thereof. When you think about how this is changing journalism practice, this change is actually significant, and it's actually reconfiguring the whole process of what we understand as mass media. And technology is changing mass media or mass communication to what professors like Manuel Castell are calling mass self-communication. So you think about certain individuals who are not even trained as journalists, and their mass followership on social media apparatus or social media applications, and they command audiences. So they are able to speak to audiences just like a journalist would, or a mainstream media platform would. And if you actually look further on this change within the African context, you realize that social realities such as a ballooning young population means that, and also looking at the idea that it is young people who are increasingly receptive to new technologies. And there's a slide that I think Bina will share with you there around, I got the slide from the World Economic Forum that is looking at projections of global populations in different continents. And that slide will demonstrate to you that if you look at it from an African perspective, African continent is the second to Asia, where the projection of population versus time against how many young people that continent will have in the next 20, 30 or 40 years. I think this is going up to 2060. Africa's projections are showing that millions and millions of young people will continue to exist within the continent, yes, but also this means that these are people, especially between the ages of 15 to 24, who will be able to receive new technologies with a lot of enthusiasm, and they'll be able to use these technologies in very significant ways, transforming our understanding of journalism, but also transforming our understanding of mass communication. And therefore, within that context, where boundaries are dissipating, whether these boundaries are temporal, or whether these boundaries are spatial, or whether these boundaries are even geographical, we tend to appreciate the idea of convergence and looking at the breakdown in relevance of political boundaries that for a long time then have defined media freedom. So then you would have people, for instance, in Uganda rallying against something that the administration in Kenya is doing, or vice versa, or within a continental perspective. And that new media ecology then brings certain nuances of understanding of what then becomes media freedom within that context, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. But there's so much we can say from a technological perspective and also from a global perspective. And I believe that this conference has already discussed a lot of these ideas around the new media ecology, and concepts such as self-mass communication, as I've already elaborated, and ideas around prosumer or consumers of media becoming producers of the media, and first-person journalism that is increasingly leading to a plurality of vantage points, where citizens are increasingly becoming empowered, that they can speak, that they can air their views, and the shift of journalism from gatekeeping to gate watching, that journalists are, their role is reconceptualized. The idea that we've held for a long time, that journalists are gatekeepers, now they're becoming gate watchers. And also concepts around networked individuals and network society. I do believe that, the conference has canvassed all that. So for me to add value and to add specific nuances of our understanding of media freedom, I thought I would look at media freedom in a Kenyan perspective, from a threat to media freedom. That is one of the main threats that we are having being chronicled, and that is threats by non-state actors to national security, or wading into the idea of terrorism, or threats to civilians and how that is impacting in a particular way how media operates, and our understanding of and how we can use that event to look at media freedom in Kenya. As I speak to you today, this past week, the Kenya Defense Forces launched a complete or a fully fledged media house. And you would ask yourself, why an organization, an agency of the government that is tasked with security, protection of a country, its sovereignty and its people, would be wading into the area of media and communication. And that brings us to some very interesting discussions around how national security is increasingly becoming a threat to media freedom within the context of East Africa, but also within the context of places like North Africa, where the threat is already existing with insurgent groups such as the Boko Haram. In East Africa, we are talking about people like the Al-Shabaab. In the Southern Africa, I don't get the name very well of the insurgent groups there, but we still have, non-state actors becoming a threat in places like Mozambique, and that stretching even to Zimbabwe, among others. But within the Kenyan context, if you look at what the Al-Shabaab have been doing, is that increasingly they've been attacking non-civilians, and as a result of these attacks that have been consistent, the frequency thereof and impact, the government has mounted counter-terrorism strategies. And within this counter-terrorism regime, then the government has incorporated information networks, using media networks as a part of it, as a way of countering these non-state threats, non-state actor threats to the national security. And as a result of this, these structural influences have had a bearing on media freedom. So, for instance, if you think about the restrictive laws that the government has come up with in a bid to combat things like terrorism. So you think about a law like what in the Kenyan context we call the Prevention of Terrorism Act of 2012. Then we also think about another law that is called the National Security Law of 2014, which is an omnibus of many laws that came together, were jointly amended by the Parliament of Kenya. And then you ferret out certain clauses within these restrictive laws. You find that journalistic freedoms have greatly been impacted in various ways because of this counter-terrorism regime. One of the ways is that journalists have greatly been denied access to information by security agencies, and especially when a terror event, for instance, occurs, or an issue of national security occurs. And the implication of this is, because of the backdrop that I've already given you, that social media platforms have increasingly become a source of information, not just for journalists, but also for the general society. You find that because of the constrained access to information by authorities to journalists, then journalists resort to social media platforms for content, to fill in what in journalism we call the news hall. And this is a form of intermedia agenda setting, which probably is a discussion for another time. But if you think about then the idea of media freedom from plurality of information and diversity of the same information, but also access to credible information, truthful information that is not propaganda, then a lot of the times these laws have been a great hindrance to the work of journalists. And then it's not just about the hindrance of this information. Even when journalists get the information, the security agencies are in a lot of control of how journalists then publish this particular information. So they control the narrative. And, to give you some anecdotal evidence about this is, if you look at Kenyan journalists or Kenya-based journalists who have been embedded with the Kenya Defense Forces, a lot of interviews that I've spoken to these journalists, and the accounts that they've given is that, you know, KDF commanders actually do screen their stories before these stories are dispatched to their newsrooms. And what this actually means is that the very independence of a journalist that is enshrined in a lot of conventional, international and local statutes, then that independence is compromised when a security officer intercepts the stories that journalists develop in the process of their production, and even before they reach the audiences. So when security officers are acting as an oversight, you know, on the role, on the work of journalists, then in itself that is a great hindrance to journalistic freedom. But the laws also have a serious implication on ideas of self-censorship. Like I've already given you the background within the Kenyan context at meso level, for instance, that a lot of journalists are working for mainstream media. And this mainstream media, the business model of this mainstream media is commercial-based, advertising-driven, profit. The bottom line is profit. And therefore, when you think about being sued by the government or other soft censorship mechanisms, you know, where government freezes advertising revenue to certain media houses that do not comply or that do not toe the line through what we call the Government Advertising Agency here in Kenya, then those are soft forms of censorship that also speak to what journalistic freedom looks like or actually is within the context of Kenya, but also this is replicated within the region, widely within the East African region. But there's a very also important nuance of journalistic freedom that we need to appreciate, that Africans tend to be very communal people. And by communal, what I mean is that there is the obligation of a person to be patriotic to their society. So when you think about when something like a terror event occurs, and this terror event occurs within the context in which you were born, you were raised, and it is the society that you know to be your home, and you are a journalist. Questions then around you know, patriotism are usually evoked by authorities to speak to how journalists produce their content. So authorities would ask journalists to be patriotic in how they report a terror event, for instance. And what being patriotic would mean probably is you violate cardinal tenets of journalism. For instance, you might not speak truth about the casualties. For instance, if it's the Kenya Defense Forces who have suffered a significant loss by the insurgents. You know, patriotism in this case would mean that you self-censor yourself and you don't really report in an accurate and truthful manner, which is in itself is not really it's not really what professional journalism means. So journalists then resort to propaganda, and by having a biased form of reporting, you know, this outright bias in favor of the government, in favor of security agencies, you know, and widely in favor of the country, you know, through the prism of, you know, patriotism or communism, or what people in South Africa would call Ubuntu, that I am because you are. So as a result of that, then, rules of journalism, such as truth, accuracy, and objectivity, are usually overridden, which in itself speaks directly to the idea of journalistic freedoms within the context of Africa. I know my colleague Mumo is involved a lot with the work of Committee to Protect Journalists, and I would allow her a chance within our 40 minutes so that she can elaborate on the cases that they deal with. But before I do so, you know, the last thing that I would want to point out is the idea of surveillance, that actually is one of The main ways in which government really has been keeping a track on journalists, and especially within the context of security, that if you're a journalist and you report on issues of national security, journalists have reported being surveilled, not just from a physical perspective, but also from their digital presence. So you find that the government knows their social behavior, knows where they live, knows the people that they meet, for hangouts and things like that, where they go, who they meet, all this in bid to or in the name of national security. Ideally, if you look at it, that is a direct infringement on the rights of these journalists, because constitutional rights are protected. Right to privacy, right to your residence, right to associate, among others. These are constitutional provisions that are actually anchored not just in the local constitution but also in international bodies. And therefore, if discussions around media freedom within a Kenyan perspective or from a regional perspective are held, then we cannot fail to look at how surveillance by security mechanisms is one of those main nuances of how media freedom or journalistic freedom looks like within the African context. So at this point then, I will allow my colleague Mumo to speak to us about the work that they do at the Committee to Protect Journalists, and to give us some nuances of what media freedom looks like from her perspective. Thank you very much for listening to me. Since there is a question and answer session or time to deliberate on the issues around media freedom in Africa, I'll be available virtually to answer or respond to questions in the best way I can. But then again, like I've already said, if you can still engage me on the social media platforms, and mainly on the Twitter handle that I've already shared with the conference, I'll be happy to respond to these particular issues that I have raised in my presentation. Thank you very much once again for listening to me, and for the invitation to speak to students during the International Journalism Week in 2021 at the University of Sheffield. Thank you.